Nau mai, hoki mai, ki a the fold, imahine, ko Duncan Greive, tōku ingoa. This is an unscheduled broadcast. It's escalated quickly. Welcome, Glen.
Thank you. I've come in quickly from a walk along the beach with the dog.
Glen is in athleisure right now, and I've just come straight from a parent-teacher interview, but we couldn't avoid this. This has the potential to be one of the biggest media stories maybe ever in New Zealand. It's early. I don't want to over-egg it, but there are seeds here that if they grow into the kind of mighty forests that it's not too hard to imagine they might, we're looking at what could be a major realignment in New Zealand media.
And something that we talked a little bit about on the pod the other day, we signalled. This
is true. If you listened to the first of the big 3 episodes on NZME earlier this week, you will... we sort of hinted that this might happen. It escalated quickly. So I'll just kind of top line what happened this afternoon and has prompted this pod. So because NZME is a listed company, that means its shares are traded on the NZX, any kind of material things that have the potential to impact the nature or the trading reality of the company have to be notified to the market. And that's what happened this afternoon. So there's a lot of this kind of sounds boring, but within it, and Glen will break it down what it means, there are extraordinary things happening. So at 1:27 this afternoon, as we record this, Thursday, March 6th, there was NZME put out an update on director nominations and shareholder proposal. I'm going to read the relevant parts. The annual shareholders meeting is to be held on April 29th, 2025, and for that period, the nomination of directors is open until Tuesday, 11th March at 5 p.m. Now, the board of directors oversee the company and who they are, and they represent the interests of shareholders. So who they are is very material to all this. So. There's a sort of a subheading, nominations and proposal from James Grenon and JTG4 Limited. NZME further advises that it has today received a letter from James Grenon in his own right and through his entity JTG4 Limited, which contains and this is the operative part, a proposal to remove all of the current directors of NZME and nominations for the appointment of 4 new directors to the NZME board, to be voted on in the upcoming annual shareholders meeting. It is intended that the 4 proposed nominee directors would choose a 5th director from the existing NZME board. So this is connected to something we talked about on the podcast on Tuesday. James Grenon is a Canadian billionaire. He's been resident in here for over a decade. He's clearly a person of means. He has made some media plays, which we'll talk about shortly, and he's bought just shy of 10% of the company, either on his own account or through one of his entities. So it's big news. Break down what it means. It's not quite a hostile takeover technically, but it's sort of walking down that road.
It's it's like a stealth hostile takeover. Is maybe a way to describe it.
That's right. So the one thing that I didn't mention that is sort of buried a bit deeper into the release is that he mentions, or he has told the board that he has spoken to other shareholders and that 37% of them are aligned with this. So you add that to his, just shy of 10%, that's 47%. That's very close to the sort of bare majority that would allow you to kind of, confidently make a move like this.
Yeah, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But if we just back up a second, just normal governance. Shareholders obviously own the company. They appoint board directors. Those board directors are usually for a certain term, but any shareholder at any time can actually put a motion forward to have them removed, and nominations can be put forward, and there's a window to do that every year. So first of all, I think this has been a surprise to Michael Boggs and the leadership team and the board, because the shareholding turned up post the result. And I imagine, I'll come back to what's likely to be happening internally at the moment, but they have been caught off guard here, I think.
Well, it's interesting, right? So clearly the shareholding did turn up. It would reach the level where it needed to be notified. But there were some things in the report that we noted on Tuesday that sort of set some. They were a bit odd. There was a statement of editorial principles that was very sort of
not normal.
It was bland, but it was quite sort of positive and pro-business, and just some stuff that you wouldn't need to say or necessarily want to say. And it was slide 5, and there was also. And this is disconnected, but we'll talk about why they could be connected, this idea of potentially carving off OneRoof. So there were a couple of things which, with hindsight, that if you were looking closely, that sort of made you think there's something going on here.
Yeah,
and it might well have been this.
And potentially that editorial piece was an appeasement, like an attempt to appease. So, but we'll come back to the detail on that. So what's happened? So obviously we've seen the NZX announcement today. And what's really interesting in that is that the reason I say a takeover by stealth is that as soon as you remove the board members, those board members are the ones that sign off and agree on the strategic direction of NZME. If they are all removed and a new board is put in, that means a possible change, or it signals a possible change in direction around that company, where that company is going to go. What's also interesting to your point is, he talked about the fact that he's indicated support. The language is interesting because in the release it says indicated the support of 37% of the shareholders. It's not a guarantee that.
Absolutely not. He also hasn't named them, and I'm sure that everyone is working the phones now. We'll get you to talk in a moment about who the shareholders are, because clearly he thinks that at least a decent chunk of them are on side here. The other thing that I think is really important to note is there's some phrasing that he uses. I don't have it in front of me, but he said he is not, I think it's the effect of, he is not currently looking to take over the business, and the currently is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. It sort of strongly implies he might one day. He's reserving his right.
Well, your definition of takeover has got to be looked at, right? Because in the normal sense, a takeover a company would be taking a financial holding that gives you a majority control. He doesn't have that. He hasn't indicated that he's going to do that. But if he's successful by getting the existing shareholders to vote to turn over the board, and he's put himself forward as one of those directors, that new director group do have control of where that company's going in its future direction. And that's why I think, whilst not an economic takeover, it would certainly be indicative of a board changing direction.
Yeah, and a sort of a functional takeover of control of the company in some respects. And so there's a few different things to kind of break out from here, because what you've got right now is that there's long been a group of NZME shareholders who largely own it because of OneRoof.
Yep.
They view that as a technology company that is performing very well by a number of different sort of more tech industry metrics, that is being, to a certain extent, held back in terms of the level of investment it could require and could benefit from, but also its value being recognised because it's sort of wrapped, it has a more traditional, entertainment publishing news media company sort of wrapped around it that is effectively holding it back and making it hard to buy. And so the people who've held it with that in mind, and they'll have been looking across the Tasman at this big $2.7 billion bid that's come in for Domain and gone, I wouldn't mind something like that for New Zealand. So they could well go, even if they've got no interest in the sort of any kind of change in the editorial direction of that side of the business, they might see this as an opportunity to, force the OneRoof divestment, which they can then realise shareholder value. That is their job if they're holding it on behalf of clients. And Grenon might say, we'll push that through. That will make the parts of NZME that he's interested in cheaper, and OneRoof can, will satisfy the interests of the people who are mainly interested in OneRoof.
Yeah, look, that potential transaction can take many forms, but and Grenon indicated, I think, on the back of a release around when he initiated the just under 10% shareholding, that he was there for investment purposes. And under that scenario, spinning off One Roof in some form is a win, but this could be an absolute win-win, because if he spins off and they get the share gains by or the valuation back in the share price through spinning off One Roof, and he's able to garner control of the board on the direction of the Herald, it would suggest that potentially the Herald privatises under that strategy. Maybe not, but just we're positing potential ideas here. But on that basis, Grenon potentially has a couple of big wins there.
Yeah, on some level, if this plays out the way it could, and this is all conjecture, as we record this happened 2.5 hours ago. We've both been sort of working the phones, but this is, neither of us have spoken to Grenon for starters. But there is a strategic genius in terms of, if it plays out that way, setting aside whatever he might do on an editorial, if you just look at it purely on and how they've sort of played the chess game with this, it's pretty incredible work, I think.
It's amazing, and like I say, there will be internally, with Michael and the existing board, there'll be a lot of calls being made right now to, the vastly majority institutional shareholders and the managers of those funds to try and understand their position on this. Because when you look at the sort of top 80-odd% of the shareholders that hold an interest in NZME, all bar a couple, are institutional investors.
So when you sort of say an institutional investor, do you want to sort of list them off and kind of talk about what that means for people who might not necessarily understand how that works?
Yeah, so institutional investors are effectively investment funds that either large banks or retirement funds, things like KiwiSaver. When your KiwiSaver dollars go away and get invested, you want a return on that, and these funds are investing in companies like NZME. And so when you look at the shareholding list, as I said, the vast majority of sort of 80% of their top shareholders are institutional investors. Now, what's interesting to me is,
do you want to just read out a few, just because people will probably be familiar with these?
Yeah, so HSBC, so those not familiar, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, custody nominees for Australia. The equivalent nominee for New Zealand from HSBC, New Zealand's ACC are on there, New Zealand Permanent Trustees, Merrill Lynch, BNP Paribas, all large, investment banks.
And so, and the kind of the point is that they would be owning it. They might be trading a position on the basis that they think there'll be value. That's what an investment bank would do. But a lot of these are, like in the case of ACC has, it bears responsibility for funding all of the accidents that might befall us, and it tries to, to hold stocks and trading out of positions to make money for that. The idea that they would be party to an editorial takeover so that's why I think it's interesting about these institutional investors is right now I think they've been told a story about, potentially told a story about value realization for One Roof, which is a narrow way of understanding this. And, according to the sort of, the shareholder value thesis, potentially like the main thing or only thing even that they should think about. But if it does become clear that there is an editorial project happening behind it, the kind that you've seen happen to a certain extent at the LA Times and starting to happen at the Washington Post, but on steroids really in terms of what this might become, again, all conjecture, but there will be pressure to kind of think more holistically about what this transaction is facilitating.
Well, it's hard to believe, not impossible to believe, but it's hard to believe. Grenon has talked about the fact that he's indicated he has 37% of the existing shareholder support, which means he has indicated that some of these institutional investors are behind him. It's hard to think that as part of that conversation, however he's had it, that the editorial question hasn't been raised from that institutional investor. So, if that's true, that question would suggest it's been satisfied to this point. And again, we have to caveat, right? Is it true? Is there actually legitimacy to that 37% number? Because we don't know. And actually, we won't know until April, I forget the date, but when actually the AGM is.
A couple of other kind of wrinkles to head on. So the Grenon's media interests to this point have been in two entities. We have touched on this on Tuesday. But just to recap, he first started this company called NZME. The irony is not lost that was a kind of a clear nod at almost a parody of NZ. It was NZ News Essentials, which is very similar to NZ Media and Entertainment, NZME versus NZNE. And as Patrick Smelly pointed out in a very good piece that I encourage you to read for Business Desk earlier this week, that the accounting firm that was the sort of registered address for both NZNE and NZME is in NZME's building, and is the same company. So these things were like a letter away from one another. So NZ News Essentials was a sort of news aggregation company. It seems to have sort of fallen down now, but it was, it came out of the post-COVID tumult and kind of basically was an attempt to say that the news hierarchy and what is being covered is not as important, it doesn't represent what should be covered. So it was an implied critique of media, and often it was quite an explicit one. Then he started up The Centrist, which was also an aggregation play. It despite its name, has a preoccupation with some issues that they're not wholly kind of far-right type issues at all. They're really more culture war type issues.
I would just on The Centrist, it was interesting because I went in and had a look around their on their website, how do they present themselves?
Yeah.
And I'll just read out, what it says. Founded in 2023, Centrist is a free online news platform aimed at curating New Zealand relevant content that is important when it comes time to vote.
Yeah, so it's a political project, right? It has Ian Wishart, who's got a long history of sort of, kind of fairly pointy alt media stuff. Doesn't have the, he's clearly somewhere in this world. Graham Adams, who's ex-Bauer, very smart guy, but he's a very pointed critique of the media is part of his remit as well. He's been part of the platform world as well, but oftentimes it's aggregating and pointing towards mainstream media stories, but often they are big stories. There might be a critique of the angle chosen or something of that nature. Sometimes it's just saying, go read this. But there is definitely the three biggest pillars, and I've subscribed to their emails from the start just to kind of, because that's the kind of psycho I am. They are sort of trans rights, sort of gender, what they would describe as gender ideology. The Treaty Principles Bill is something that they monitor, and the whole kind of, they've got a preoccupation with Te Ao Māori and how that is being transmitted into various organisations. And the big thread, and I sort of, that feels like it's sort of foundational to it, is vaccine efficacy, vaccine injuries, and often that will be where a lot of the other stuff is domestically focused. This is often international kind of research, or it, so like sometimes it is, very legitimate research. Sometimes it's, less so. But those are kind of three areas that are of consuming interest to centrists. Now, that doesn't mean, to be clear, for the avoidance of doubt, that doesn't mean that is what the Herald is going to become. That's just the information that we have about the way that James Grenon, and he's no longer even
he's not an owner.
Yeah,
no.
He's not the owner of the Centrist, but it was set up and it has behaved the same way the whole way through. The current owner is a Canadian too. It's it's certainly, if you're looking to try and figure out what this might mean from an editorial perspective, I think it's very fair to look hard at the Centrist, but people who are listening should do their own research on Grenon.
I think it's also interesting, you gave the Washington Post example. We all know about Jeff Bezos and their, LA Times, but they're around the world now. You look at a lot of news, I hate using that word, but news media companies where people of significant wealth are looking to take an investment and a stake, and part of that is and this is, by the way, not a reflection at all of NZME. I'm talking generically about around the world, where you see a older operating model no longer starting to work, investors coming in, and through that have the potential to have some influence, right?
It's really interesting because I've been covering the rise of a sort of a right-leaning alternative media on the spin-off for a few years now, and so you've got Wainwright Jr. who's funded the platform, and you've got the Common Room, which was a sort of a comment site, right-leaning, not particularly extreme by any means, but what they represented was a kind of a broad dissatisfaction with the mainstream media, and the early approaches to that were to start something new, and that's what you can view the centrist as well, as part of that same tumult. And then, but the thing that's always been interesting is that because the business model of media has been so destabilized, the actual cost of acquiring these massive, they're still massive reaching, and they still have huge amounts of kind of institutional power, cultural power, political power. That's plummeted. Like a company like NZME, if you were to try and assemble it 25 years ago, put together the radio and print assets involved, would have been billions of dollars.
Yep.
And now there's a plausible path to Grenon gaining effective control of it for less than $100 million.
Well, and it also doesn't have to be an economically poor decision as far as the Herald's concerned, because if One Roof is spun off, you've kind of got one organisation, huge amount of value creation, huge upside, enabling effectively Grenon to do what he likes with the Herald.
Yeah, it's and that's where the sort of the genius part of it comes in. Is this can be, and the other assets of NZME, there are people who think that they're undervalued too.
Yeah,
and they might be right. And it might be that he just comes in and kind of, just separates the companies, realizes some value creation, and sails off to the sunset. It's just for an investor who's just looking to invest, he's got there's some history there which is very interesting.
I think the other interesting thing on all of this is there's a company called Osmium Partners, again, an investment fund from the looks of it out of San Francisco, and they're the fourth largest shareholder, so now after Grenon. And prior to obviously all this news breaking today, they had put forward a request or a nomination for 2 new board directors to come in. So either way, there's a push for new board directors to come in from the existing shareholding group, which would suggest, if anything, they want a particular direction taken for the future of the company. Whether that's at odds with what Grenon is putting forward in terms of his direction, we don't know, but that in itself could be interesting of whether, there are kind of holding these polarized shareholder positions on where that company should be in the future.
Absolutely. And, to be clear, this is all happening to NZME.
Yes.
NZME isn't asking for this to happen.
No.
The executive didn't ask for it. The current board didn't ask for it. Certainly the staff didn't. I've been messaging a couple of staff members. They describe it themselves as being terrified, almost like it's like almost like a hostage situation.
Yeah.
They've already just been through this pretty brutal restructure to move resource from print journalism or written journalism towards video, and now there's the spectre of something orders of magnitude more scary on the horizon. Again, we don't know. But it's reasonable if you're a staff member there to start being quite concerned that the nature of your job, the direction of your job, the forces acting on your job could change here.
Yeah, they'll be looking to Michael and the leadership team for confidence very, very quickly on this. It's not necessarily in Michael's gift to actually be able to know exactly how this is going to play out. But he will be, and, key board members, as I said, they will be busy, no doubt, talking to those institutional investors as we put this pod to air, trying to ascertain the various positions, where the support is, where the support isn't. It'll be quite instructive to see over the next couple of days whether Michael or NZME come out and suggest that there is not 37% support or suggest something different. Who knows? Who knows?
And there's a lot that can happen from here. If the institutional investors start to feel pressure to kind of display their hand, and then there is a parallel pressure on them from the kind of constituents to kind of maybe pick a side and not that side. That could change things. Equally, if Grenon feels like that's the way it's going, he absolutely has the right to kind of bid up the shares and buy more on the open market, or to try and just buy a chunk of them from an institutional investor. There could be quite a concerted effort mounted to protect this. There will be a political dimension too. Yeah. So, it's not hard to imagine that some of the parties of government or some MPs within the parties of government might look upon this quite kindly. And also there's almost like a sort of a national interest here, because you have the closest thing we have to a paper of record is the Herald. You have enormous reach and power in something like News Talk ZB. Now, some of what the Grenon critique, if we're going to sort of infer it from centrist, some of that, I don't imagine that there'd be people in the ZB world and listeners who would be right on board with it. But I don't imagine that Mike Hosking is going to look at this and be applauding it, because what he has right now is exactly as much editorial freedom as he needs. So even people you might make assumptions about within the NZME world who might not be completely, ruling any of this out of bounds, I don't think anyone inside the company is going to be thrilled about this.
Well, I know a lot of people inside that organisation, as do you, and all of them, every single one of them, if you suggest for a moment that there is any bias in their editorial opinion, and they just value their editorial independence so highly. And so that'll be the concern from them, is going, are we going to be, curated here? Are we going to be, asked to go down a particular path? But at this point, that's pure speculation. We don't know any of that.
It is. And it's also really hard to do with any editorial organisation of substance, is that you can have your opinion, you can even install your board, you can probably get a CEO and an editor involved, but it's just really hard to get an editorial organisation to sing from a particular song sheet with the best will in the world. So,
well, you just got to look at the Washington Post. Look how many very, very, very senior editorial staff walked over the position that the Post chose not to take around the US election, because they felt Bezos was, exerting, a level of editorial influence over the paper's position.
That's right.
And they walked.
Yeah. So, and that's a hard thing to ask someone to do in this economy, and especially in the our domestic journalistic economy is worse than the US one. And so there's it's not like, even if they don't walk, there are lots of things you can do as a journalist who values their independence to sort of resist that kind of impulse. But look, that's basically what we know right now. It's very much a developing story. There will be so many more fronts that kind of open up on this. And I should stress that all of this, has been trying to infer things from the known facts. May well be that we're wrong about some chunks of this, but this is just the best of our knowledge and analysis at this time. Glenn, thank you for rushing in today.
You're welcome.
Fascinating situation, really potentially troubling situation. Also, could all blow over by next week.
Well, that's right. It could be nothing, but it also has the potential to be, literally the biggest media story we've ever seen. So, who knows?
We'll stay on it. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Te here for leaping on this. Appreciate it.